The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Lori Fisher from CallTrackingMetrics, and we are excited to talk to everybody about GDPR. We've been very busy preparing for GDPR across the past year and kind of thinking through all the different ways it's affecting us and our customers. So as it's new to many of us, we expect there will be lots of questions that come up about it. And so we look forward to gathering questions from everybody and kind of talking through your own individual use cases. We are going to have the session in listen only mode, and we will leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So as you have questions, feel free to use the question panel in GoToMeeting to ask your questions, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. Okay, so just a quick disclaimer. We're all learning a lot about GDPR, and we would say that we are not GDPR experts here at CallTrackingMetrics. We're definitely learning a lot. There's a lot of specifics that are very dependent upon your particular use case, what information you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and how you're collecting it. So we can definitely give you general information and tips for the settings and features in CallTrackingMetrics that will be very helpful for you for GDPR compliance. But we definitely would recommend that you talk to your own outside counsel about your particular use and kind of what you're collecting and what they think you need to do to be compliant with GDPR. So there's a few of us on the call here today. My name's Lori again. I am the co-founder and COO of CallTrackingMetrics. I've been here since the very beginning. And I'm joined today by Bob Grawl, who's a senior engineer on our development team and has been working actively on a lot of the new features and functionality to prepare for GDPR. And then we also have James Clark from DLA Piper, who has been very helpful in helping us to navigate GDPR and has a lot of experience working with organizations around the world as they get ready for this. So we're going to kind of focus on three areas. We're going to start by giving you kind of our brief synopsis of GDPR. Then I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about how CallTrackingMetrics can help you comply with GDPR. And then, like I said, we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So let's start with a little overview about GDPR, and especially we're going to focus on some of those areas that we think are most relevant for how customers are using CallTrackingMetrics. So about GDPR, the GDPR is a regulation on data protection and privacy for all individuals within the EU. It aims to give control to citizens and residents over their personal data and to simplify the regulatory environment by unifying a regulation within the EU. It was adopted in 2016 and becomes enforceable after a 2-year transition period, which is on May 25th. So it's coming up very quickly. GDPR is significant. It's wide-reaching in scope, and it's attempting to bring kind of a 21st century approach to how companies and individuals think about protecting data. It also extends the scope of EU data protection to all companies processing data of EU's residents. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that scope. It brings a set of digital rights to individuals over their personal data. They have ownership and rights over their data in a new way. And the penalties are significant. This is very serious and can mean a lot of money for businesses who are not complying. So let's talk about the scope a little bit more here. So the regulation applies if the data controller, which I'll talk more about, but that's basically the organization that's collecting data, or the processor, which is the organization that's processing data for a controller, or the data subject is based in the EU. So what that means is that this can be affecting you even if your business is not in the EU, if in any way you are collecting information from EU residents. So it can affect many companies around the world and not just those that are based in the EU. And the scope of GDPR is personal data. And so what is personal data? It's really any information that can directly or indirectly identify a person, and it can be in any format. The European Commission defines personal data as any information relating to an individual, whether it relates to his or her private, professional, or public life. It can be anything from a name, an address, a photo, an email address, bank details, posts on social media websites, IP address. You'll notice these kind of two categories I have on the screen here. The GDPR regulation places even stronger controls on the processing of special categories of data. And you'll notice biometric and genetic data is a new inclusion on that list. So I kind of think about it, here in the US, we have to deal a lot with HIPAA. And so I kind of think about personal data a lot like PHI and HIPAA. But there's these kind of two categories as GDPR looks at data. So let's talk a little bit about the roles of GDPR, because like HIPAA, that can get kind of confusing. And so let's start with the data controller role, which is in the middle there on this screen. So the data controller is the person that has the responsibility and liability to implement effective measures and be able to demonstrate the compliance of processing activities, even if some of those activities are carried out by another company, like a data processor, on behalf of the data controller. So the data controller is the one who's determining the purpose and how, the means of processing the personal data. In the scenario of working with CallTrackingMetrics, there's kind of two scenarios. So scenario A in that data controller box is where CallTrackingMetrics is the data controller. This actually is probably the less common situation. This is where we're collecting information, for example, for our own marketing efforts. If you fill out a form on our website to request a white paper, or you sign up for an account with us and you provide us contact information for that account, we're controlling the collection of that information. The second scenario B, is probably the more common one as we think about kind of all the data that is coming to CallTrackingMetrics. And that is where our customers are actually the controller. And that's the scenario where all the information that you're collecting using our application is hitting our application. So all of the data that you're collecting about your phone calls and your text messages and your website visits, you are the controller of that collection. And we are your processor in that scenario. So the data controller, again, there's two different scenarios. If we then move to the right on this screen and we think about data subjects, in scenario A, where we're collecting information as the controller, the data subject there is our customer. So someone in the EU signs up for a CallTrackingMetrics account, the data subject is the person who signed up for that account. In scenario B, where our customer, you are the controller, the data subject in that case is your end users, your end customers, the people calling your phone lines, the people filling out your forms, people visiting your website. If we move over to the left of the slide here, data processor, in most cases, CallTrackingMetrics is going to be a data processor for you. And we have processors that we use too, which are sub-processors. So you think about companies like Amazon Web Services or Twilio. Those are sub-processors of us. So we as a data processor have other processors that we use as well. And so those are the sub-processors. So here it is kind of mapped out in a chart because again, it does get confusing. So you've got kind of the supervisory authority at the top. You've got the data controller, which is our customer who's collecting all this useful information about their phone calls and using it in CallTrackingMetrics reporting. And then below the data controller, you have CallTrackingMetrics as the processor. And then, like I said, we have sub-processors as well. So people like AWS and Twilio and Plivo and others that we work with. And then at the bottom, the data subjects are all of your customers and the people interacting with your websites and your phone numbers. So let's, now that we kind of have the scope under control, let's talk about what the law actually, or the regulation actually says. So Article 5 of the regulation describes the principles relating to the processing of personal data, and there's 6 of them. And they talk a lot about how data should be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently. It should be collected for specific, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a way that is incompatible with those purposes. purposes. The collection of the data should be adequate, relevant, and limited to what you're actually trying to do. So you should not be collecting information that you don't need or cannot kind of justify why you're collecting it. Personal data should be accurate and kept up to date. Personal data should be kept in a form which permits the identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary, right? So keep things only as long as you need them. And personal data should be processed in a manner that ensures the appropriate security of the data, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing or accidental loss, destruction, or damage. In this article where it lays out these principles, it also talks about how the controller is responsible for and has to be able to demonstrate compliance with these principles. So again, that gets back to that chart I just showed you about the roles and kind of the importance of the controller role and the responsibility that they have. So if we think about lawful processing and what exactly that means, basically what the regulation says is that you have to have a valid lawful basis in order to process personal data. And there's 6 bases for processing. And as I understand it, no single basis is better or more important than the others. And which one is most appropriate to use will depend on your particular purpose and your relationship with the individual. Most lawful bases require that processing is necessary. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. If you can reasonably demonstrate that it's necessary to collect the information, then usually you are okay. But if you could reasonably achieve the same purpose without processing that data or collecting that data, then you might need to rethink, why you're collecting it and how you're justifying that. You should determine your lawful basis before you begin collecting data and processing it, and you should document it. So as Bob's going to talk about, like one of the exercises we went through was thinking through information that we're collecting, thinking about why, what it's used for, and document that in your privacy notices. Now, consent is obviously the first basis here for processing, and that's a big one, particularly as we think about the marketing community with which we interact every day. Consent is a big one, and there's a lot of things you need to think about with consent. If consent is used as a lawful basis for processing, it must be explicit what the data is being used for, right? What's collected and what the data is being used for. There's also specifics around how consent for children must be given and how it must be given by the child's parent or custodian. And data controllers have to be able to prove consent. And those data subjects in the EU also have to be able to withdraw consent. Now, this area of consent is obviously it has implications for the use of, forms and opting into email campaigns and things like that. But it also, as we think about call tracking metrics, it also has implications for businesses who record phone calls as a matter of practice. The typical kind of these calls are being recorded for training purposes probably will no longer be sufficient to gain assumed consent to record those calls. So one of the things Bob's going to talk about are some tools and tips for how you might be able to make sure you're gaining consent for recording through your call flow. And that'll be important so that you can demonstrate that you have consent for that recording if you have callers from the EU. So individuals' rights, like I said, a big part of GDPR is giving rights to the individuals over their data. So let's talk just a little bit about kind of what that is. So the right of access gives citizens the right to access their personal data and information about how this personal data is being processed. And the controllers have to provide on request an overview of all the data that they're collecting and a copy of the actual data if they're being requested that. So one of the things that Bob's going to also talk about is how you can make sure that you have access to export data and edit data and erase data that you might need to in call tracking metrics in response to one of your end users' request to exercise one of these rights. People need to be able to transfer personal data. So things like being able to export calls out of call tracking metrics, export text is obviously going to be really helpful for this. records. And data that's been sufficiently anonymized, interestingly, is excluded from a lot of this. But data that is de-identified but remains possible to link back to the individual is not. So one of the things is, depending on how you're kind of using data that's coming in through CallTrackingMetrics, and maybe you're using our API to kind of move information from CallTrackingMetrics into your own system, the anonymization, pseudonymization are kind of important things to think about. Is, can you store the information in a way that can no longer be linked to an individual? Because then that makes it a lot easier on you for the storage of this information. Data security and breach reporting, I'll end on this because this is obviously a really important one and something that we've been thinking a lot about. Under the GDPR, the data controller is under the obligation to notify the supervisory authority without undue delay about any kind of breaches. There's a maximum of 72 hours after becoming aware of the breach to make the report. Individuals need to be notified. In addition, data processors will have to notify controllers without undue delay after being aware of a personal data breach. So, as you think about us being a processor for you, or the controller, it's really important for us to be able to notify you as soon as possible if there's any kind of issue, so that then you can notify your subjects about the issue. So that's just, again, a very high-level overview. We are not experts. We learned a lot in our journey here. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about some of the more specific kind of tactics in CallTrackingMetrics that you can use to help with GDPR.
Hi, everybody. Let me just get my window open here. Okay, thank you, Lori. In this section, we will talk about CallTrackingMetrics platform and a few things that have changed or are new to help our customers comply with GDPR. Although GDPR goes into effect on May 25th, we updated our privacy policies on May 1st. We essentially have two policies because we are a controller and a processor. We're a controller for our marketing and our marketing related activities, and we're a processor for our customers that use our CTM platform. And we have sub-processors too, so we'll talk about them in another slide. Our updated terms of service went into effect on May 1st. One of the major changes was the definition of personal data that Lori covered. And we have a new data protection section that covers specific GDPR requirements. When CTM is operating as a processor, any third parties that process or could process data are sub-processors. And before using a sub-processor, we have to evaluate the security, privacy, and confidentiality practices of the sub-processor. You may also hear another term regarding sub-processors called DPA, or Data Processing Agreement. We maintain DPAs with our sub-processors, and a DPA is very similar to a BAA if you're familiar with HIPAA. Before GDPR, there were different requirements regarding data leaving the EU. Today, the GDPR has provisions that allow data to be transferred and stored outside of the EU. Section 21.4 of our terms of service has the specifics regarding transfers and GDPR and data protection. So this is not specific to GDPR, but we need to be specific for GDPR compliance regarding access to data. Our customers control whether or not CTM staff can access additional personal data. We have limited access to calls and like the call log, but we can't listen to recordings or do any of that. So we maintain the minimum access required, and then if you enable it, we can do other access. For instance, if we have to listen to a recording to verify that recordings are working, we will only listen to enough of the recording, maybe the beginning or the end or the problem area, to verify that that where the problem in the recording was. So we have several tools to help you with GDPR in your account. Each level of security that you add on top of your account will help you with your GDPR compliance. So we suggest unique logins for everyone. You can do two-factor authentication. We have pins and passwords for recordings. All of those will help with compliance. And then the next thing that really you may need to do is just start disabling some features that would collect personal information that you aren't allowed to collect. For instance, call recordings, Lori mentioned this, and I will read a quote from a website. It says that businesses wishing to conduct call recordings will have to draw up specific call recording policy outlining which of the processing conditions they believe apply and why, detailing how they go about all things such as obtaining consent from participants and measures in place to protect recordings from misuse. So it sounds pretty scary, and as you can see, you're just going to have to decide whether or not you can record the call, and if you do, you're going to have a policy in place and why you're doing it, and all that. There are certain reasons you're allowed to record a call. For instance, you can do it if it's a legal reason, or like if you're a financial institution, you may be able to record the call. On our side, if you do need to record calls, or if you need to get the consent from the caller to record calls, you can set up an IVR that would prompt the customer to say, hey, this call may be recorded, but if you don't want to be recorded, press 2, and then their recording would be turned off. And you may also need to have a way to set up a way to transfer a caller to a non-recorded call. So if during a call they said, you know what, I no longer want this call to be recorded, you would have to be able to stop the recording. Some other features, we have an automatic redaction feature. So this is good for accounts or agencies that know they need the data for reporting purposes for a period of time, but maybe after 60 days or 90 days, you want to just redact all the data. And then one of the major parts of GDPR is this right to erasure, or the right to be forgotten. And we have a manual redaction feature, which allows you to just eliminate a call or all the calls from a particular caller, and that would redact their information. And there might be some things you want to avoid regarding call tracking and GDPR. For instance, we have a major feature for notifications, and you can send notifications and say, hey, there was a call, but no longer can you send the personal information about the caller. You don't want to send their phone number, you don't want to send their name, because if that escapes into the wild, if it was in an email or a text or something like that, then you're liable for that information. So you could send a link to the notification. You can say, hey, a call happened at a certain date and time. Here's the link to the call. Somebody can use the link. If they're a valid CTM user, then they can log in and access the information and decide what's appropriate, or use the call as appropriate. And then other things would be like caller ID. We have an enhanced caller ID feature, which is mostly US based, but it gathers data that you may not be able to collect, as like income, number of children, education level. And if you're not specifically collecting that information, you would not want to have that turned on. And if you don't need caller ID, if you're purely just trying to do marketing attribution, you may not need the actual caller ID. In that case, you can turn caller ID off. You would have their phone number, but you may not have any of the extra information that comes in as part of caller ID. And then obviously at the end, you can redact the information if needed. So as we've gone through all of this GDPR, we realized that we needed to provide a place for everybody to go and get GDPR information. So we created our GDPR hub, and we'll continue to update it and the blogs and the help articles and anything that changes on our platform to enable and help you comply with GDPR. So that's it for section 2. On to questions.
Sure, and I just want to follow up too on the resources piece. You guys will find links in the chat window, so you definitely want to save those and bookmark them. The first link is to the CallTrackingMetrics GDPR page, and this just provides a bunch of resources, links to our new privacy and terms of service, as well as cookie policies and other things. So definitely bookmark that link. And also there's a link that's been provided by DLA Paper, which is a great resource to learn more about GDPR compliance. We also have a few questions here, so I'd like to go ahead and we'll get started. And again, if you have additional questions, please put them in the questions panel of GoToWebinar. Let's see, so the first one here, to what extent will this impact my business if I am not located in the EU, excuse me. James, maybe you could go ahead and address this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Laurie, and thank you for having me on the call. So the extraterritorial scope, if you're not established in the EU, it can really bite in two key ways. So first of all, if you are offering goods or services to individuals in the EU, so if you have a kind of B2C business and you have consumers in the EU who you are selling your products or services to, then that activity will be caught by GDPR. And then the second way you can be caught, which is arguably a little bit wider, is where you are monitoring individuals in the EU. And unfortunately, we don't have a really clear idea of what monitoring means. We do have some guidance, and one of the things that's expressly been called out in relation to what constitutes monitoring is tracking people online. So, you know, arguably something as innocuous as kind of setting cookies on a website, which then track a user in the EU, you know, around that website, could constitute monitoring. And certainly things like recording of a call, I think, would constitute monitoring. So, you know, even just by kind of recording a call of someone in the EU, arguably that's monitoring, and that's caught by GDPR. There is some comfort that you may be able to take in the fact that, you know, our understanding of this at the moment, and we've got nothing which contradicts this currently, is that there has to be some kind of you know, targeting of people in the EU. So as a business, you have to be aware that, you know, you are offering your goods and services to people in the EU or monitoring people in the EU. If it just happens incidentally, then there is an argument that you're not caught. But certainly, I think, you know, as a business, if you are aware that you have customers in the EU, then you should treat that activity as caught by GDPR.
Yeah, thanks, James. So this question is, can I use the API to manage my data and use the redaction features? Maybe Bob, you could take this one.
Yes, yes, you can. You can use our API to do all of the same things that we do in the platform. Our platform is mostly implemented via our API. So if there's a feature that you see on the platform, you should be able to do it using the API.
Perfect, thanks. And let's see, James, this one might be another great one for you to take. They want to know, how do I handle data transfers outside of the US when we have clients in the EU?
Okay, so you've got a client in the EU, they're transferring their data to you in the US, and then there's a further transfer by you outside of the US. Is that the question? Or is it the initial transfer from the client to the US?
It looks like it's from the, let's see, data transfers outside of the US when they have a client in the EU. So transferring that data outside of the US for a customer who's in the EU.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so there are kind of two steps to this, which is why I suppose I asked the question. Because, you know, first of all, there's the initial transfer, isn't there, from the customer in the EU to you in the US, and that is a restricted transfer under GDPR, just like it is under the current law. So to begin with, there would have to be a mechanism which enabled the customer to transfer their data to you in the US. And without going into too much detail here, I mean, some of the common mechanisms are, you know, you in the US being Privacy Shield certified, the EU-US Privacy Shield certification scheme, which replaced the Safe Harbor scheme a few years ago. Or the main alternative to that is entering into something called the standard contractual clauses or model clauses, which is the method that CTM uses for transfer compliance. And if you enter into, or if you use either the standard contractual clauses or, in fact, Privacy Shield, there is then an obligation to effectively you know, flow down those terms to any third party where you make an onward transfer of that data. So if you then transfer the data on again to somewhere outside of the US, say you send it to you know, a service provider that you use in India, for example, then you would have to have a contract with that service provider which flows down equivalent data protection terms to those that you've agreed with your customer.
Got it. Perfect. Let's see, here's another one. Lori, this might be a good one for you. Do I need to request a DPA from CallTrackingMetrics?
Yep. Okay. So short answer is no. When we updated our terms of service and privacy policies in early May, we included all the standard contractual clauses that you would need to have included. So no, you do not need to request a DPA with us. It's a little bit different than HIPAA, where HIPAA, you specifically have to have an agreement in place with, every single relationship. In this case, we have it included in our terms of service, and we sent a notification about that update at the end of April. So if you haven't taken a look at it yet, I would read through the terms of service, and you'll see, like Bob said, we have a whole new section on personal data and all of the kind of GDPR related clauses that you need to constitute the data processing addendum.
Okay, here's another one. James, maybe you could also help us with this one. Can someone really ask for all of their data to be deleted?
Yes, this is a common question. So the right to erasure, I think, is one of the scarier parts of GDPR for a lot of businesses, and it's kind of understandable why. But it is a right which does only apply in limited circumstances. So the kind of simple way of thinking about this is, provided you still have a legitimate reason for needing that data. So you collected it for a specific purpose, and you still need the data to carry out that purpose, then someone can't ask for it to be deleted. Well, they can ask, but you can refuse to comply. So where it will engage is essentially where you've held on to data for longer than you need to. So you collected it for a specific purpose, you've satisfied that purpose, and therefore under the data protection law, you don't need that data anymore. And in those circumstances, someone can ask for it to be deleted. There are some exceptions which applies to that. So the original purpose may have been satisfied, but you may be able to legitimately say, for example, that you still need to hold on to the data because it's relevant to legal claims that you anticipate you may need to defend, for example. So that's a kind of exemption. But generally, the rule is, if you still need it for the purpose it was collected for, the erasure right doesn't apply. If you don't need it anymore, then the erasure right does apply. So if someone puts in a kind of blanket request and they say, please delete all of my data, then the first thing to do is to do a bit of an analysis of, well, what information do we hold about that person? What personal data do we have on them? And looking at that, what of that do we still legitimately need? And what of that data do we not need anymore? We've held on to it for too long, and we'll delete the second category.
Got it. Thank you. And we're getting a couple different varieties of this question, but again, James, this is probably a good one for you. Can I be sued by a regulator or data subject in the EU if I am not based in the EU?
That's a really good question. So I think it's difficult, right? And this is a really important practical point to remember. So if you may be kind of US, if you think about the big tech giants, you may be kind of US headquartered, but often, even under the current law, how the regulators will enforce against them is through via their EU establishment. So, the Irish Data Protection Authority will go against Facebook, and not Facebook Inc. in California, but against Facebook Ireland, where they have their European headquarters. If you don't have any kind of establishment, no branch office, no subsidiary in the EU, then practically speaking, it does become a lot more difficult regulators can go after you, but whether they can actually enforce a fine that they would impose on you or enforce you to comply with an order that they give you is much more debatable. And certainly I think it's fair to say that the focus of regulators and where they can be most effective will be in taking action against companies that are established locally. However, if you are doing something which impacts data subjects in the EU and they complain to their regulator, their supervisory authority, then it's something that the supervisory authority will have to look at. And we just don't really know yet because we've not had extraterritorial scope in this way before. We don't know what the appetite will be in practice, but I think it is fair to say that it will be much harder for regulators to go against companies not established in the EU, and therefore they are probably less likely to do so, but don't ignore it.
Yeah. So I think we also have time for a few additional questions here. And just in case anybody, if we don't answer your questions live, then we will definitely follow up with an email.
Okay, great. Looks like a couple of other questions. Bob, I'm going to have you answer this one. The question is, if we don't serve the EU and we're using Form Reactor, for example, could we have a checkbox to ask if you are an EU resident citizen, and the next screen would say, sorry, this service is not available to EU residents or citizens?
So you could certainly have a form that prompts the user, and I've even run into one of those in the wild. Here's the reality: you're allowed to collect the information. It's just you need to make sure that you're using it appropriately, right? So you could collect the information, you could have them answer that question, and then after you've collected the data, maybe for EU citizens, you redact that data so that you know that you had a form submission, but you didn't, but you're not actually going to save the information, or maybe you just decide that you could, send them to another page that says, sorry, we can't help you. But that's up to you, right? So, but it's not that you're not allowed to have the information. You just have to be very specific about how you're going to use the information, store the information, and all those things. So it's okay. And I've run into that form before, I'm an EU citizen, yes, and then they are obviously doing something different on the backside as far as how they handle the information.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Another question is, Bob, the questions you or the features you brought up earlier, and the scenario around whether or not someone wants to be recorded or not, and can we stop or start recording? This question is, are these features currently available? So one thing I'm going to post into the chat is a link to a help article that we have for everyone, which walks through kind of how to set up a lot of the kind of features that Bob ran through, and has some links to helpful help articles. So I'm posting that in the chat right now. But yeah, the short answer is yes, we do have all of those features available. So for example, like Bob said, you could have callers hit an IVR menu that asks them, if you would like to proceed and have your call recorded, press 1. If not, press 2. You could then have key press 2 route to an unrecorded line, whereas key press 1 routes to a recorded line. And you can figure out like the exact language that legally covers you. But that type of functionality, yes, is really easy to set up. If you need to stop and start call recording mid-call, the API allows for stop-start call recording. If you are not using our API, what we would recommend doing is transferring the call to an unrecorded line. So at that point, when someone asks to stop being recorded, transfer the call through like the soft phone, for example, to an unrecorded line that you could just have set up in CallTrackingMetrics that's kind of designated for these types of scenarios. Bob, anything else you'd add with that one?
No, I don't think so. There's probably also a way to do this with if you're using our soft phone, stopping and stopping recording may be possible using our Lambda functions, but that would be an advanced feature for sure.
Okay, we have another question here that basically is asking, once we kind of redact call data, is the reporting still accurate in aggregate? And that's something that we've thought a lot about, how the redaction can impact reporting. And it will impact some of your reporting because you can imagine the level of detail that's available with your phone calls is affected. You're not going to be able to see, for example, the location of the website visit that was matched to your call. But the aggregate high-level reporting, if you just need to know how many calls hit this tracking number, which is associated to this advertising channel, yes, that will still be there. But there definitely will be some implications for the reporting. And so you again kind of need to think through like what aspects of the data that you're collecting is really crucial for what you're doing. Because if you can demonstrate that it's crucial and that you need it for what you're doing for that customer, then like Bob said, you can still collect that information. You just need to think about what information you actually need to collect and why. This is a good one. And James, actually, this would be a great one if you could help with, just so we make sure we get this right. We have a question about consent. Specifically, it's that if we are, let's say we are a dentist in the EU and we're using CallTrackingMetrics, do we need to have a pop-up that is presented to all visitors of the site requesting consent for them to continue?
So the simple answer to that is no. And in fact, you shouldn't have kind of blanket consents to do a range of things. So, I mean, consent is it's a very high standard under GDPR. So where you are required to obtain consents, your consents have to be very specific. They have to be limited to, you know, a single particular activity. So, i.e., the recording of a phone call or a consent to receive email marketing communications. So, kind of limited to one activity, and they have to be, you know, very clear in the language, and they have to result in someone taking an affirmative action, such as, you know, ticking a checkbox or signing something to indicate their consent. But in lots of cases, there will be an alternative and a better lawful basis to process someone's data other than consent. So, for example, you know, if someone just, you know, if someone calls you up with a query, then you may need to obtain consent in order to record the call, but you don't need consent just to, you know, collect the information that they give you over the call, to talk to them, etc. You know, that will all be done on a different lawful basis. If someone, you know, just comes to browse a website, you don't need to collect a consent, you know, just to, you know, for them to kind of use the website or to provide you with information on a form on the website. You know, there are alternative legal bases for that. So, I mean, the key ones to be aware of, you know, where it often comes up are, you know, in the context of marketing. So if you want to be able to send marketing communications to an individual, in most cases, the most appropriate way to do that is to obtain a specific consent from someone, which allows you to then send the marketing communications. Call recording is a good one. So outside of circumstances where, you know, as we said earlier, as a financial services organisation, you may be required to record the call, in which case you don't need to obtain consent. But in other cases, you probably do. Or where you may be processing special category information. So, and I suppose this may be relevant to a dentist. So if you know that you need to collect some health information, for example, because that's special category data, you may need to get a consent just in relation to that, you know, health information, but not to the other things that you were doing with the kind of non-special category data.
Great, thank you, James. So I think that's all the questions that we have today, and I would just like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for attending. And certainly if you have any questions or need additional information, we've got a resources slide. I'll have some contact information for you right here. And there it is. So there, so if you have any questions for our team at CallTrackingMetrics, you can send us a message to support@calltrackingmetrics.com. Privacy-specific concerns can go to that other email address, privacy@calltrackingmetrics.com. And of course, we accept mail inquiries as well. James, thank you again for joining us today. Lori and Bob, thank you, everyone,
Thank you.
and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.